Welcome back to Gillette Stadium, everybody. My name is Mike Petraglia, joined as always by Patriots expert writer for WEEI.com, Christopher Price. Chris, I think a lot of Patriot fans are breathing a little bit easier knowing that one of the true heart and soul characters on the team, one of the true leaders of the team, Vince Wilfork, is not going to be playing anywhere else but New England, probably for the foreseeable future, probably for the rest of his career after the 3-year, $22 million extension. Your thoughts?
I thought it made a lot of sense for both sides. I think both sides gave a little bit. I think that's what it took to get this deal done. Look, I'm a Vince apologist. I make no bones about it, and I think he did a very good job in acknowledging where he was at this stage of his career and realizing, you know what, I got to back off a little bit here. You know, I'm a defensive lineman on the plus side of 30. I'm coming off a season-ending injury. I have to give a little. The Patriots gave a little, and I think in the end it worked out for both sides. Look, when you talk about Vince is a really interesting guy. He's not the face of the franchise in a Tom Brady type, but he's a bridge to those Super Bowl teams, a decade or so ago. He's a leader. He's a very important guy in that locker room. He commands respect from guys on both sides of the ball. He was a very important guy to bring back.
Well, look, Tom Brady is the leader of the Patriots, inside the locker room, outside the locker room. But if you ask players to a man, the one player they respect the most and look up to the most in that locker room, and you and I have been around that locker room quite a few years now, it's Vince. It's number 75. When he speaks, everybody listens, especially on the defensive side of the ball.
You know what's really interesting, too, is there are not a lot of guys in the history of this franchise, in the recent history of this franchise, who are like that. There are guys that come to mind. Kevin Falk was one, Junior Seau. The offensive guys stick with the offensive guys, and the defensive guys stick with the defensive guys. There's not a lot of crossover. When you have a guy like Vince who's able to command respect from both sides of the ball, those guys are rare. Those guys are really interesting. I always compare Brady is like the CEO in the locker room. Brady's the guy who's kind of above everyone else. Yep. You want to get a sense of how the locker room is and the real feelings of the players. You go to a guy like Wilfork. Wilfork is like one of the office managers. Wilfork is a guy who has the seniority there. He knows what's going on in the locker room. Wilfork is absolutely key to the success of that franchise, both on and off the field, and it's a good thing for both sides that they were able to get a deal.
We also know very full well, Chris, that he is not being paid to be a cheerleader and a team captain. He is being paid to be one of the best, and hopefully, for the Patriots' sake and their fans' sake, one of the very best run stoppers in the NFL. The big question is, and everybody knows this, he did not suffer an ACL injury. A lot of people come back from ACL injuries and don't have to scramble around and can build up the leg strength. He is coming back from a torn Achilles. Big, big difference. And there's a lot of people, a lot of NFL scouts, a lot of NFL observers of the Patriots who question whether or not Vince can be the player he was.
It's a great question. It really is. And I think when you looked at the contract that they were able to put together for him, it's not a coincidence that there are a lot of pregame or per game incentives in that contract. He has to be on the roster on opening day. He makes a certain amount of money for each game that he is involved in. So I don't think it's coincidental that all of those are tied together. But yeah, there are questions about where he is at this stage of his career. Look, Vince is not an every down guy anymore. I think that's very clear. At one point in his career, he really was.
That's a couple of years ago. Point.
A couple of years ago, he was. He's not an every down guy anymore. And when you're playing as much nickel and as many sub-defensive packages as you have to do to survive in today's NFL, he's going to be a guy who's going to come off the field, maybe at the expense of a Tommy Kelly, or if they're ever able to get Armand Armstead on the field on a consistent basis. When you have two defensive linemen, Vince isn't necessarily that guy anymore, and it's going to be interesting to see how he transitions into this stage of his career.
You were in the owners' meetings, at the owners' meetings, I should say, down in Orlando, Florida, where it was reported that really the ice began to thaw a little bit in the relations between the Patriots and Vince. First of all, did you think it had to get to the point where Vince was going to make that threat, that reported threat, that I'm going to ask for my release and move on if you guys don't give me the money and renegotiate a deal that's fair for me?
History tells us that that's the case. Yeah, I went back and I wrote on this when this was happening, that you remember back to the end of the 2009 season when they were going to threaten to put the franchise tag on him. Vince had no part of it. He said that was a slap in the face. The end of the 2009 game, some of his teammates told me afterward that he was going around on the sideline saying goodbye, basically saying, look, if this is the last game I play with you, I've had a great time, I've had a great run, we've had a lot of fun together. That was 4 years ago. So history tells us that Vince is a guy who runs hot and cold, emotionally. And I think it had to get to that point.
Right.
Both sides understood it and were able to draw back. And again, fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and they were able to work out a deal.
What were your impressions of Belichick at the owners' meeting? You were there at that breakfast table, the famous breakfast gathering with Bill, when he's full of smiles and loads of details about the strategy of this franchise going forward.
I thought that he threw off a couple of good lines, talking about, being photoshopped into the coach's picture and stuff. So that was a fun back and forth. A couple of things really stood out to me, though. One of the things, Jason Cole engaged him in a Q&A about how guys this year, more and more, for the last couple of years, wide receivers are coming into the league who never worked with a college playbook. And it was interesting to hear his breakdown of how you deal with those guys and the understanding that you have to show with those guys when it comes to their transitioning to the NFL level. It just kind of, some kind of behind the scenes, some kind of insight in terms of coaching, in terms of working with young guys that I thought really didn't get a lot of pub coming out of the coach's breakfast. But yeah, I mean, he was his typical Belichick self. He did offer a few a few points on Revis and a few points on Browner and a few points on LaFell. Some of the new guys, as well as some history with Vince. But there were a couple of really interesting things in that vein that I think kind of went under the radar when you're talking about that breakfast.
And one more thing, real quick, Chris. Bob Kraft, it was reported in a column by Ron Borges that he's tired of dealing with the petty cash issues. The issues of the Vince Wilfork, if you want to throw that into the petty cash category, I don't know if I would, but he's tiring of the money issues when it comes to salaries in the NFL, and particularly against Patriots. Your take on where you think Robert Kraft stands on that?
Well, I think when you look at the Patriots and you look at their top shelf talent, they pay very well for top shelf talent. I think the misconception is that the Patriots don't spend. They don't spend to the cap. Well, they do spend to the cap more often than most teams do. They'd like to keep that financial flexibility. Right now, I believe they have
$4 to $5 million.
Yeah, about $4 to $5 million for kind of a rainy day fund if they need to extend Devin McCourty, which there's a rumor out there that they're working on that deal. That's a possibility. That'll give them a little bit more financial flexibility. But I think historically, Patriots spend pretty well. And I think that's one of the things that people don't really understand. When you look at contracts for guys like Vince, Tom, when you look at Logan, when you look at some of the other guys that they've had here over the years, Randy Moss, they spend pretty well. And I think that's, again, one of the misconceptions that people have about the franchise. I think maybe that's one of the things that he was kind of alluding to when he was talking about that.
Well, we'll certainly get together again, Chris, here at Gillette Stadium as the NFL draft approaches in early May. We'll have the OTAs, we'll have the June mini camp, then obviously training camp in July. This will be not the last time we talk in the next couple of months, that's for sure. He's Christopher Price. I'm Mike Petraglia, outside Gillette Stadium, WEEI.com.